Have you ever caught yourself cringing at a memory and whispering, "I can't believe I was like that"? Maybe it was something you said in anger, a choice you regret, or a moment when you let fear guide your actions. That sting of regret you feel, it isn't punishment. It's actually proof you've grown. What feels like shame is often your soul signaling, you've evolved, you're no longer that person. But here's where it gets confusing. If regret is a sign of growth, then why does it hurt so much to look back? Why do certain memories feel like wounds reopening, even though the moment is long gone? Psychology tells us it's because we hold two truths at once, the person we used to be and the person we've become. That tension creates an inner conflict that feels heavy, almost unbearable at times. Yet what we rarely realize is that this discomfort is a marker of transformation, not failure. Think of it this way. Your past self was surviving with the tools they had. Your present self looks back with new awareness, and that's why it stings. It's not because you're broken, but because you can finally see the difference. In fact, that gap between who you were and who you are now is one of the clearest signs that real growth has taken place. The pain of hindsight is actually the evidence of evolution. So the real question becomes, what do we do with this pain? Do we keep replaying the past, shaming ourselves for choices we can't undo? Or do we learn how to soften that pain, transforming it into compassion, into self-forgiveness? In this video, we're going to explore the psychology behind that process, why regret hurts, how to quiet the inner critic, and most importantly, how to finally meet your past self with the compassion they've always deserved. Think about a time when your past choices no longer make sense to you. Maybe you remember words you once spoke in anger, or a decision you made when fear was guiding you. Instead of pride, what you feel now is a sting of discomfort, a sense that you've outgrown the person who made those choices. That uneasy knot in your stomach isn't random, it's the tension of identity, your brain wrestling with an old self that no longer fits, while a new self is still taking shape. That gap between who you were and who you are becoming is where the discomfort lives. Psychologists call this clash cognitive dissonance, the mental tension that arises when your past actions no longer align with your present values. And while it feels uncomfortable, even painful, this is actually one of the clearest markers of growth. The very fact that you can look back and cringe means you've evolved beyond that old way of thinking, coping, or reacting. What feels like shame is really transformation in motion. Here's the fascinating part. Research shows that our brains process this inner conflict in ways similar to physical pain. In other words, when you say, "I can't believe I did that," your body actually feels that dissonance as discomfort, almost as if you touched something hot. That's why regret can feel so sharp and heavy. It's your nervous system signaling, this no longer fits who you are. So instead of seeing that discomfort as proof of failure, what if you saw it as a signal of change? Or remembering that your old choices were survival patterns, born from the tools you had back then, and your present awareness is simply showing you how far you've come. This tug of war isn't punishment, it's proof of transformation knocking at the door. What's one moment from your past that feels painful to remember, and what does it reveal about how much you've grown since then? Inside all of us, there are two voices constantly shaping our inner world. The first is the inner critic, sharp, loud, and unforgiving. It's the voice that says, "You should have known better," or "You're not enough." Then there's the inner child, quiet, tender, and still carrying the weight of unmet needs and unhealed wounds. What many of us don't realize is that when the critic scolds, it's really the child who hears those words, and that child doesn't need more punishment, they need compassion. Think back to a moment when you coped in a way you now regret, maybe numbing yourself with food, alcohol, or avoidance. The critic swoops in and says, "You're weak, you're broken, you failed." But if we pause long enough to look deeper, a different truth emerges. Perhaps that failure was really your inner child trying to survive the only way they knew how. Instead of condemnation, what if the words sounded more like, "You were hurting and you did your best with what you knew"? Suddenly, judgment softens into understanding. Here's the psychology behind it. Research shows that self-criticism activates the brain's threat system, flooding your body with cortisol and keeping you stuck in survival mode. On the other hand, self-compassion activates the care system, releasing oxytocin and calming the nervous system. In other words, the very way you speak to yourself determines whether your body braces for attack or feels safe enough to heal. That's why shifting the dialogue from critic to caregiver isn't just emotional, it's biological. Imagine this reframe. Instead of saying, "I was so stupid," try, "I was scared, and I was coping the only way I knew how." That shift doesn't erase accountability, it adds context, and context creates compassion. What once looked like weakness begins to reveal itself as resilience. That younger version of you wasn't broken, they were simply burdened by pain they hadn't yet learned to carry. So the next time the critic's voice rises, pause and ask yourself, what is my inner child actually needing right now? Safety, comfort, reassurance? When you speak to yourself with compassion, you're not excusing the past, you're healing the very part of you that never got what they needed. Because forgiveness doesn't start with silencing the critic. It begins with learning to comfort the inner child. For most of us, the idea of self-compassion sounds nice in theory, but almost impossible in practice. We've been conditioned to believe that being hard on ourselves keeps us accountable, that self-criticism is what makes us better or pushes us to achieve greater things. But here's the paradox. Psychology shows the opposite is true. Harsh self-talk doesn't make us stronger, it keeps us stuck in cycles of shame. Compassion, on the other hand, isn't weakness, it's one of the most powerful forms of resilience. Dr. Kristin Neff, a pioneer in self-compassion research, gives us a framework to understand this. Self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. Each principle is simple on its own, but together they create a radically different way of relating to ourselves. Self-kindness replaces judgment with gentleness. Common humanity reminds us that suffering isn't a flaw, it's part of being human. And mindfulness teaches us to acknowledge our pain without being consumed by it. These aren't feel-good ideas. They're evidence-based practices that actually change the way our brain and body respond to hardship. Imagine this. You fail an exam, or maybe you mess up a big presentation at work. The critic inside jumps in. "I'm so stupid, I'll never get it right." That thought doesn't motivate you, it paralyzes you. But what happens if you apply Neff's 3 steps? First, self-kindness. This hurts, but I can be gentle with myself. Second, common humanity. Everyone makes mistakes, I'm not alone in this. Third, mindfulness. I can notice my disappointment without letting it define me. That one shift in perspective turns a cycle of shame into an opportunity for growth. And here's the science. Studies show people who practice self-compassion are less likely to experience anxiety and depression, more likely to take accountability without spiraling, and even more motivated to change destructive habits. Why? Because compassion creates safety, and the nervous system needs safety in order to heal. When you stop attacking yourself, your brain and body finally have the space to learn, adapt, and move forward. When you weave kindness, humanity, and mindfulness together, forgiveness stops feeling like a heavy obligation and starts feeling like a natural outcome of being human. You stop asking, "How do I erase the past?" and instead ask, "How do I care for myself, the one who lived it?" That shift changes everything. Forgiveness is no longer about excusing what happened. It becomes about finally offering yourself the care you've always deserved. What's one small way you can practice self-kindness the next time your inner critic shows up? Have you ever noticed how some of your deepest emotional wounds feel as though they've been buried for centuries? Like a mummy, carefully wrapped in layers of linen, your pain has been preserved, not out of reverence, but out of fear. These emotional bandages are the protective layers we create around ourselves to keep the world from touching the rawness beneath. Over time, though, what was meant to protect us becomes suffocating. We can't breathe freely, and we struggle to move toward the life we long for because we're trapped in wrappings that no longer serve us. Unwrapping your inner mummy is not about rushing into the pain or ripping off the layers at once. Instead, it's about tenderly peeling back each bandage with patience and compassion. Perhaps one layer is the belief, I can't trust anyone. Another might be, I'm too messed up to be loved. These thoughts are not who you truly are. They're just the coverings you've used to survive. The more you begin to loosen these metaphorical wrappings, the more glimpses you'll catch of your authentic self beneath them, waiting for air, light, and love. For example, imagine someone who grew up in a home where showing emotion was seen as weakness. As an adult, they might tightly wrap themselves in stoicism, never crying, never asking for help, and convincing themselves they're fine no matter what. But beneath that wrapping lies a tender heart, aching to be seen and comforted. As they slowly unwrap themselves, perhaps by admitting their struggles to a trusted friend, or even allowing themselves to shed tears in solitude, they begin to experience the freedom of no longer needing those old layers. The journey of unwrapping is not linear. Some days you'll feel brave enough to remove a layer, and other days you'll feel tempted to wrap yourself back up again. That's part of healing. The key is not to shame yourself for the wrappings, but to honor them for the role they once played in keeping you safe. Then, with love, allow yourself to gently let them go. When you do, you'll find that beneath all those layers isn't emptiness. It's you, the radiant, whole, authentic you who has been waiting patiently to breathe again. Now let me ask you, what's one thing you've started to let go of in your own life? Maybe it's the belief you always have to be strong, or the habit of apologizing for who you are. Share it in the comments below. Your story might be the reminder someone else needs to hear today. What's one belief or protective layer you're ready to begin loosening? Forgiving yourself isn't about erasing the past. It's about transforming your relationship with it. Instead of carrying old choices as heavy chains, you begin to see them as stepping stones. Each moment of pain, each mistake was actually a chapter in the story that shaped who you are today. The truth is, your past self wasn't broken. They weren't weak. They were doing the best they could with the tools, awareness, and resources they had at the time. That version of you was simply trying to survive. And survival is never something to be ashamed of. It's something to honor. When you look back now, you have the gift of perspective. You can hold your past self with compassion, almost as if you're holding the hand of a younger version of you. You can say, "Thank you, you got me here. And now I'll take it from here with love." That shift from judgment to gratitude is where true self-forgiveness lives. And today, you are the living proof that you made it through. The challenges you once thought would break you have instead made you wise, resilient, and more compassionate than you realize. That is the power of rewriting your story with gentleness. And here's the beauty. Throughout this series, you've been given reflection questions designed to help you pause and see yourself with new eyes. Each of these questions is a doorway, one that leads not to perfection, but to compassion. So here's my invitation. Take one of today's reflection questions and spend some time journaling with it. Notice what comes up without judgment, and if something shifts in you, even a small reframe or insight, I'd love for you to share it in the comments. Your voice might be the very thing someone else needs to hear to begin forgiving themselves too. Because when we choose self-forgiveness, we don't just heal ourselves, we create ripples of compassion that touch everyone around us.